Michelle Johnson wiped the sweat from her brow as she stepped back to admire the small swing set she had just finished assembling in her backyard. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the sun shining brightly, casting long shadows across the neatly cut grass. The swing set, a bright, cheerful mix of red, yellow, and blue, stood proudly in the corner of the yard, the seat swaying gently in the breeze. It had taken her weeks to save up for it, cutting back on groceries and skipping her morning coffees. But the look on her daughter Lily's face when she had unveiled it that morning had made every sacrifice worth it. As she watched Lily and her little brother, Jake, take turns swinging higher and higher, their laughter echoing through the quiet suburban neighborhood, Michelle felt a rare, deep sense of satisfaction. She had worked so hard to provide for her kids, to give them the kind of safe, happy childhood she had never known. But that sense of peace was shattered the following Monday when Michelle found a crisp white envelope taped to her front door. The HOA logo was emblazoned across the top in harsh, metallic blue, the letters standing out against the smooth white paper like a warning. Michelle felt a pang of anxiety as she tore open the envelope, her eyes scanning the neatly typed letter inside. "Dear Ms. Johnson," the letter began, its tone cold and impersonal. "This notice serves as a formal fine in the amount of $1,000 for the unauthorized installation of an unapproved swing set on your property. According to Section 5.3c of the Community Aesthetic Standards, structures of this nature are strictly prohibited without prior approval from the Homeowners Association. Failure to remove the offending structure within 14 days will result in additional fines and potential legal action." Michelle's hands trembled as she lowered the letter, her pulse racing, her mind spinning with a mix of confusion and anger. $1,000? For a swing set? She glanced out the back window, her eyes locking onto the bright, cheerful structure that had brought her children so much joy just days before. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she folded the letter and set it down on the kitchen counter. This had to be a mistake. She had read the HOA guidelines when she first bought the house. Nowhere had it said anything about swing sets being prohibited. A few days later, Michelle decided to attend the next HOA meeting, determined to clear up what had to be a simple misunderstanding. She arrived early, her pulse quickening as she stepped into the community center, the sharp, artificial light reflecting off the polished wooden floors, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. The room slowly filled, the chairs scraping against the floor as her neighbors filed in, their voices a low, steady hum of small talk and polite laughter. Michelle took a seat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for the meeting to begin. At exactly 7 p.m., the HOA president, Barbara Monroe, took her place at the front of the room, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and crisp, white blazer giving her the air of a minor royalty. She cleared her throat, tapping her manicured nails against the thick binder in front of her as the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," Barbara said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "We have a lot to cover tonight, so let's get right to it." For the next 45 minutes, Barbara droned on about landscaping regulations, trash pickup schedules, and the importance of maintaining community standards. Michelle's heart raced as she waited for her turn to speak, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the letter she had brought with her, the neatly folded paper already slightly crumpled from the tension. Finally, Barbara flipped to the last section of her binder, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced down at the page. She cleared her throat again, her lips curling into a small, tight smile as she looked up, her eyes locking onto Michelle. "And now," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "I'd like to address a recent violation that has come to our attention, a clear example of the kind of rule-breaking that threatens to undermine the very foundation of our community." Michelle felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks as the heads around her began to turn, curious eyes settling on her as Barbara continued, her tone growing sharper with each word. "Ms. Johnson," Barbara said, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the room like a whip crack, "has chosen to install a brightly colored swing set in her backyard, a clear violation of our aesthetic guidelines. A structure that stands out like a sore thumb against the carefully curated, harmonious appearance of our community." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd, the sound sharp and cutting, each one like a small, jagged blade digging into Michelle's already frayed nerves. Barbara leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the binder in front of her as she fixed Michelle with a cold, calculating stare. "It's this kind of disregard for the rules," she continued, her tone dripping with disdain, "that makes it so difficult to maintain the high standards we all work so hard to uphold. Perhaps, Ms. Johnson," she added, her smile growing sharper. You should consider moving to a community more suited to your personal tastes. Michelle felt her fist clench in her lap, her pulse pounding in her ears as she struggled to keep her composure, her mind racing with thoughts of her children, of the sacrifices she had made to buy this house, to give them a safe, happy home. She forced herself to meet Barbara's icy stare, her jaw tightening as she whispered a silent promise to herself. This wasn't over. Michelle Johnson woke up the morning after the HOA meeting with a knot in her stomach, the echoes of Barbara Monroe's sharp, cutting words still ringing in her ears. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with thoughts of the public humiliation she had endured, the thinly veiled threats, and the cold, judgmental stares of her neighbors. She had hoped that by standing up for herself at the meeting, she might at least earn a small measure of respect, but instead, she had only become a target. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her eyes fell on the brightly colored swing set in the backyard, its red and yellow seats swaying gently in the morning breeze, the metal frame gleaming in the sunlight. She felt a pang of worry as she imagined the letter still sitting on her kitchen counter, the $1,000 fine hanging over her head like a dark cloud. She had barely taken a sip of her coffee when the doorbell rang, the sudden, sharp chime making her jump. She set her mug down on the counter, brushing her hands nervously against the front of her faded jeans as she crossed the small, tidy living room, her bare feet cool against the hardwood floor. When she opened the door, she found a man in a dark suit standing on her front steps, a thick, leather-bound folder clutched tightly in one hand. He was tall and thin, his hair neatly combed, his eyes hidden behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the harsh morning light as he looked down at her over the tops of the frames. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice crisp and professional, each word enunciated with sharp, deliberate precision. Michelle felt her heart skip a beat, a cold knot forming in her stomach as she forced herself to nod, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "Yes," she said, her voice a little too tight, a little too high. The man adjusted his glasses, flipping open the leather folder with a quick, practiced motion as he pulled out a thick stack of papers, the crisp, white sheets rustling softly in the morning breeze. "I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association," he said, his tone as cold and impersonal as the letters that had begun flooding her mailbox. "I've been instructed to deliver this to you." He thrust the stack of papers into her hands, his eyes flicking briefly to the brightly colored swing set visible over her shoulder before settling back on her face, his lips curling into a small, tight smile. "The board has decided to impose a daily fine of $100 for your continued refusal to remove the unauthorized swing set from your property," he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "These fines will continue to accumulate until the structure is removed, and if you fail to comply, the HOA will have no choice but to place a lien on your home." Michelle felt her breath catch in her throat, her fingers tightening around the thick stack of papers as her mind raced, the cold knot in her stomach twisting tighter with each word. "A lien?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she struggled to process the man's words. "You can't do that. I've paid my dues. I've followed the rules." The man's smile grew tighter, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his glasses as he leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to ignore our community standards," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I suggest you take this seriously, Ms. Johnson. The board doesn't take kindly to rule breakers." Without another word, he turned on his heel, his polished black shoes clicking sharply against the concrete steps as he made his way back to the sleek, black sedan idling at the curb. Michelle watched him go, her pulse pounding in her ears, the thick stack of papers trembling in her hands as the engine roared to life, and the car pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. Michelle stumbled back inside, the door swinging shut behind her with a dull, echoing thud as she sank down onto the edge of the couch, the stack of papers still clutched tightly in her hands. She flipped through the pages, her eyes skimming the dense, neatly typed paragraphs, the legal jargon and fine print blurring together as her mind raced. It wasn't just the $1,000 fine anymore. Now they were threatening her home, her children's stability, the very foundation of the life she had fought so hard to build. That afternoon, as her daughter Lily and her younger brother Jake played outside, their laughter ringing out across the yard. Michelle stood at the kitchen sink, her hands clenched tightly around the edge of the counter as she watched them through the window, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and anger. The next day, as Lily and Jake swung back and forth, their feet kicking up small clouds of dust as they raced each other to see who could swing the highest, Michelle heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up just in time to see Barbara Monroe and two other HOA board members striding down the side of her house, their eyes locked on the children as they approached the swing set. Barbara's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile as she crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing as she watched the children play. "You too," she called, her voice sharp and cold, cutting through the warm afternoon air like a blade. "Are being entirely too loud. This is a quiet, respectable community, not a playground." Lily and Jake slowed their swings, their small, wide eyes flicking nervously to their mother, who had stepped out onto the back porch, her fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest as she met Barbara's icy stare. Barbara took a slow, deliberate step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the sun-warmed concrete as she leaned in closer, her eyes locked on Michelle's. "If you can't control your children," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, "perhaps we'll have to consider notifying the proper authorities. It would be a shame if someone were to report you to Child Protective Services." Michelle felt a surge of cold, unfiltered rage flood her system, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her voice steady. "Leave my children alone," she said, her tone low and dangerous, her eyes locked on Barbara's. "You don't get to threaten my family." Barbara's smile only widened, her eyes gleaming with a twisted, malicious satisfaction as she turned on her heel, her perfectly styled hair bouncing lightly with each step as she strode back toward the front of the house, her two silent, smirking companions close behind. Michelle watched them go, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she clenched her fists tighter, the sharp, burning pain in her palms doing little to dull the white-hot rage that now coursed through her veins. Michelle Johnson sat at her kitchen table, the stack of HOA notices and threatening letters spread out before her like a pile of unpaid bills. The fine had ballooned from the original $1,000 to over $3,000, each daily penalty piling on like bricks in a wall, trapping her in a financial nightmare that threatened to swallow her home. She had barely touched her coffee, the mug growing cold beside her as she ran her fingers through her hair, her mind racing with thoughts of how to fight back, how to stand up for herself and her children without losing everything she had worked so hard to build. Outside, the sounds of her children playing on the swing set drifted through the open window, their high, carefree laughter a painful reminder of what she stood to lose if the HOA followed through on their threats. She had tried to stay strong, to ignore the snide comments from her neighbors, the icy stares, the whispered gossip that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But it was becoming harder with each passing day, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her like a physical force. Then, one morning, as she was cleaning the breakfast dishes, her phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a notification from her neighborhood social media group. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the soapy water as she reached for the phone, her heart sinking as she read the message that had been posted to the group overnight. "Beware, trouble on Elm Street. One of our residents, Michelle Johnson, has a history of legal troubles. Just a reminder to watch your kids and keep your property safe." Michelle felt her stomach drop, the words blurring before her eyes as her pulse quickened, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She clicked on the post, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the thread of comments that had already begun to pile up beneath the original message. "Isn't she the one with the swing set? No wonder she doesn't respect the rules. I've heard she's a single mother. Probably can't even keep track of her kids, let alone her property. Didn't she have some kind of custody battle a few years back? Sounds like trouble to me." Michelle felt a cold knot form in her stomach, the sharp, jagged edges of panic slicing through her as she realized what was happening. Someone, Barbara, she had no doubt, had dug into her past, found the old court records from her divorce, the bitter custody battle she had fought and eventually won to keep her children, and was now using it to turn her neighbors against her. She felt her fists clench at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to breathe, to think, to focus. She had spent years trying to rebuild her life after the divorce, to prove to herself and to her children that she was strong enough to stand on her own, to create a safe, loving home for them. And now, all of that hard work, all of those sacrifices, were being torn apart by a petty, vindictive HOA president with too much time on her hands and a twisted sense of power. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, the cold stares sharper, the once friendly waves from her neighbors fewer and farther between. Parents who had once let their children play in her yard now pulled them away when they passed her house, their eyes avoiding hers as they crossed the street to avoid the troublemaker on the corner. Michelle found herself walking to the mailbox with her head down, her shoulders hunched, the tight, nervous smile she used to offer her neighbors now replaced by a tight, grim line as she hurried back inside, her heart racing, her breath coming in short. Shallow gasps as she locked the door behind her. One morning, as she was walking Lily to the bus stop, one of the other mothers, a woman Michelle had once considered a friend, quickly steered her children away from them. Her eyes darting nervously to Michelle's face before she pulled her kids across the street without so much as a nod. Michelle felt a sharp pang of hurt, the sudden, unexpected sting of betrayal cutting deeper than she would have thought possible. Later that afternoon, as she stood at the kitchen sink, watching Lily and Jake play on the swing set through the open window, her phone buzzed again, the harsh, metallic chime shattering the fragile, tentative calm she had tried to wrap around herself like a protective shell. It was a text message from another neighbor, a woman she had once carpooled with to PTA meetings and soccer games, the message short, blunt, and as cold as a winter wind. "I don't think it's a good idea for my kids to come over to your house anymore. I'm sure you understand." Michelle felt her hands tighten around the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white as the sharp, biting pain of rejection twisted in her chest, the cold knot in her stomach tightening into a hard, unbreakable lump that threatened to choke her. She had become a pariah in her own neighborhood, a walking, talking cautionary tale, the subject of whispered gossip and nervous glances, the woman with the swing set, the unfit mother who couldn't control her kids, the troublemaker who didn't belong. Michelle stood at the kitchen window, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she watched her children play, their bright, carefree laughter echoing across the yard, each high, ringing peal a painful reminder of the life she had tried so hard to build, the home she had fought so hard to create. She felt her fists clench at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as a slow, simmering anger began to rise in her chest, the cold, jagged edges of fear and humiliation slowly giving way to something harder, sharper, more dangerous. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them drive her out of her home, tear apart her family, strip her of her dignity. She had come too far, fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let a petty, vindictive HOA president and her pack of gossiping followers tear her down. Michelle took a deep, steadying breath, her jaw tightening as she turned away from the window, her mind already racing with plans, with ideas, with strategies. She had a fight ahead of her, a battle to win, and she wasn't going to back down. Michelle Johnson had spent the past few weeks living like a ghost in her own home, her once warm and welcoming neighborhood transformed into a hostile, unrecognizable place. The cheerful greetings and friendly waves from her neighbors had vanished, replaced by cold stares, whispered gossip, and the pointed silence of people crossing the street to avoid her as she walked her children to the bus stop each morning. But Michelle was done being afraid. She had reached her breaking point, the slow, simmering anger that had been building in her chest finally boiling over as she realized just how far Barbara Monroe and her petty, vindictive HOA were willing to go to tear her down. Late one night, as her children slept in their small, shared bedroom, their soft, rhythmic breathing the only sound in the house, Michelle reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. Her pulse racing as she found the name she had been searching for, James Turner. She hadn't spoken to her cousin in years, their lives having taken very different paths after high school. James had gone to law school, built a successful career as a civil rights attorney, and earned a reputation as a fierce courtroom fighter, a man known for his impressive win record and his unshakable commitment to justice. Michelle hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the call button as 1,000 doubts flooded her mind. What if he didn't remember her? What if he was too busy, too successful, too far removed from the small, quiet neighborhood battles that had consumed her life? But then she thought of her children, of the small, brightly colored swing set in the backyard that had sparked this whole nightmare, of the home she had fought so hard to build and protect, and she forced herself to press the button, her heart racing as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, the line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice echoed through the speaker. "This is James." Michelle felt her breath catch in her throat, a wave of relief and fear washing over her as she closed her eyes, her free hand clenching into a tight fist at her side. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she forced herself to speak. "It's Michelle, your cousin. I need your help." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of rustling papers, a chair creaking as James shifted in his seat. "Michelle," he said, his tone sharp, his voice suddenly more alert, more focused. "Hey, it's been a long time. What's going on? Are you okay?" Michelle felt a small, tight smile tug at the corners of her mouth, the warmth of his voice, the genuine concern, like a lifeline in the darkness. "No," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly as she fought to keep her composure. "I'm not okay. I'm in trouble, James. I'm in real trouble." Over the next hour, Michelle poured her heart out, recounting the long, painful saga of her battle with the HOA, the fines, the threats, the harassment, the smear campaign that had turned her neighbors against her, the isolation and fear that had slowly consumed her life. James listened in silence, his deep, steady breathing the only sound on the other end of the line as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a desperate, emotional torrent. The dam she had built around her fear and anger finally breaking as she confessed the full extent of her suffering. When she had finished, there was a long, heavy silence, the weight of her words hanging between them like a storm cloud, the only sound the faint, rhythmic ticking of the old kitchen clock on the wall. Finally, James cleared his throat, his voice low and steady, each word carefully measured, like the slow, deliberate click of a rifle bolt being locked into place. "All right," he said, his tone firm, his jaw set. "I hear you, Michelle. I'm going to help you. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to be ready to fight. This isn't going to be easy, but I promise you, we're going to make them pay for this." Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tight knot in her chest loosening slightly as she closed her eyes, her free hand rising to cover her mouth as a small, choked sob escaped her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. "Thank you, James." A few weeks later, as the next HOA meeting approached, Michelle found herself sitting in the back row of the community center, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her pulse racing as she watched the room slowly fill with her neighbors, their eyes flicking toward her with a mix of suspicion and disdain as they took their seats. At precisely 7 p.m., Barbara Monroe swept into the room, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her white blazer crisp and spotless, her eyes cold and calculating as she took her place at the front of the room, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the thick binder in front of her. "Thank you all for coming," Barbara said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. "We have a lot to cover tonight, so let's get started." For the next half hour, Barbara droned on about lawn maintenance, garbage pickup schedules, and the importance of maintaining community standards, her eyes occasionally flicking to Michelle, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smirk as she spoke. Finally, as the meeting drew to a close, Barbara flipped to the final section of her binder, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced down at the page. "And now," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "I'd like to address a recent incident involving one of our residents, a clear example of the kind of rule-breaking and disrespect for community standards that we simply cannot tolerate." Michelle felt her pulse quicken, her fists tightening in her lap as she prepared for the inevitable public shaming, the sharp, cutting words that had become all too familiar in recent months. But before Barbara could continue, a tall, sharply dressed man in a dark suit rose from his seat in the back of the room, his broad shoulders and sharp jawline casting a long, imposing shadow as he stepped into the aisle, his polished shoes clicking softly against the polished wood floor as he approached the front of the room. "Excuse me," James said, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the sudden, shocked silence as he reached the front of the room, his sharp eyes locking onto Barbara's pale, wide-eyed face. "I believe you're about to make a very serious mistake." Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her perfectly manicured hands tightening around the edge of her binder as she struggled to regain her composure. "And you are," she stammered, her voice suddenly small, uncertain. James slipped a thick, neatly bound stack of papers from his briefcase, his jaw set, his eyes cold and unblinking as he stepped closer to the podium. "I'm James Turner," he said, his tone sharp, his voice ringing out clearly in the stunned silence. "Michelle's attorney. And I'm here to inform you that she has just filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against this HOA for harassment, defamation, and discrimination, naming each and every one of you as individual defendants." Barbara Monroe sat alone in the small, windowless conference room at the back of the HOA's office, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously against the polished surface of the long, wooden table. The sharp, echoing click of her nails against the wood was the only sound in the room, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh, unflattering shadows across her pale, tightly drawn face. The lawsuit had hit like a bomb, the thick stack of papers James Turner had handed her at the last HOA meeting still sitting in front of her, its neatly bound pages filled with the kind of cold, hard legal language that made her stomach turn and her pulse race. She had spent the past few days in a state of quiet, simmering panic, her carefully constructed world slowly unraveling as the full weight of Michelle's legal attack became clear. Barbara had tried to downplay the lawsuit at first, brushing it off as a desperate attempt by a single mother with no real resources, a last-ditch effort to fight back against the inevitable. But as the days passed and the documents continued to pile up, each one more damning than the last, she had come to realize just how badly she had underestimated Michelle, and just how much trouble she was really in. The door to the conference room swung open suddenly, the sharp, metallic clang of the handle shattering the tense silence as James Turner strode into the room, his broad shoulders and tall, imposing frame filling the narrow doorway as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. Barbara felt her heart skip a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she straightened in her chair, her hands tightening around the edge of the table as James dropped a thick, neatly bound folder onto the table in front of her. The papers inside rustling softly as they settled into place. "We need to talk," James said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully measured, like the slow, deliberate click of a gun being loaded. "I've been doing some digging, and I think you're going to want to hear what I found." Barbara felt a cold sweat break out across the back of her neck, her perfectly styled blonde hair suddenly feeling too tight against her scalp as she forced herself to meet James's unflinching stare, her pulse pounding in her ears as he reached down, flipping open the folder with a quick, practiced motion. "You see," James said, his tone growing sharper, his eyes narrowing slightly as he began flipping through the neatly typed pages. "While I was preparing Michelle's case, I decided to take a closer look at the HOA's finances. And what I found, well, let's just say it's not exactly what I'd call above board." Barbara felt her stomach drop, the cold, hard knot of fear in her chest tightening as James pulled a thick stack of bank statements, financial records, and internal emails from the folder, spreading them out across the table like a deck of carefully stacked playing cards, each one bearing the sharp, incriminating sting of a well-placed ace. "For starters," James continued, his tone growing colder as he tapped one of the documents with a long, accusing finger, "I found multiple instances of misappropriated funds, thousands of dollars in HOA dues funneled into private accounts, personal expenses disguised as community improvements, and more than a few questionable withdrawals that I'm sure the IRS would love to take a closer look at." Barbara felt her breath catch in her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for one of the documents, her perfectly manicured nails shaking as she scanned the neatly typed rows of numbers, each one a small, jagged dagger aimed straight at the heart of her carefully constructed financial empire. "And that's just the beginning," James said, his voice rising slightly as he leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto Barbara's pale, wide-eyed face. "I also found evidence of illegal liens, property owners being charged thousands of dollars in bogus fees, their homes threatened with foreclosure if they didn't pay up. And then there's the discriminatory practices, the fines, the threats, the harassment. You've created a hostile, toxic environment, and you've been using your position as HOA president to bully and intimidate anyone who dares to stand up to you." Barbara felt her stomach turn, her pulse pounding in her ears as she looked down at the stack of documents in front of her, the cold, hard reality of her situation sinking in like a lead weight in her gut. She had always prided herself on being in control, on maintaining a tight, unbreakable grip on her little corner of the world, but now, as she sat across from the tall, imposing figure of James Turner, she felt that grip slipping, her power crumbling like dry sand between her perfectly manicured fingers. "And now," James said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as he leaned in even closer, his eyes never leaving Barbara's, "you're going to pay for it." Within days, the story had gone viral, the shocking, scandalous details of the lawsuit spreading across social media like wildfire, the hashtag HOA horror quickly trending as neighbors, former residents, and outraged homeowners from across the country took to the internet to share their own horror stories, their voices joining together in a loud, angry chorus of defiance. Local news stations picked up the story, their cameras rolling as reporters staked out the entrance to the once quiet, tree-lined streets of Barbara's upscale neighborhood. Their microphones thrust into the faces of shell-shocked residents as they struggled to come to terms with the sudden, violent collapse of their carefully curated community. Barbara's phone rang nonstop, the harsh, shrill chime cutting through the tense silence of her once pristine living room like a knife. Each new call, each new text, each new email a fresh reminder of her crumbling power, her unraveling empire. As the lawsuit wound its way through the courts, James continued to dig, uncovering more and more evidence of Barbara's financial misconduct. The carefully hidden skeletons in her closet finally dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. By the time the trial began, Barbara and her fellow board members were facing not only the loss of their homes and their reputations but also the very real possibility of prison time, their once proud community reduced to a chaotic, divided shell of its former self. And as for Michelle, she became a symbol of resilience and courage. Her brightly colored swing set now a rallying point for a neighborhood desperate to reclaim its sense of community, its sense of justice, its sense of pride. As the cameras rolled and the reporters jostled for position outside the courthouse, Michelle stood on her front porch, her children playing happily in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the warm summer air as she smiled, her heart light, her spirit unbroken. Her victory complete.